I think it's important to ask what constitutes an actual happening, or an event which shakes the world and changes the trajectory of history. Does this event have to be the end of civilization, something that big? Or can it be as simple as the death of a leader and the transition to another? For me, what constitutes a happening is an event which shifts the paradigm or frame of reference in which all world events are viewed. An event which creates a period in its wake where all discussion regarding a subject matter must refer back to that event for its frame of reference. In modern Catholicism, Vatican II is a happening. Across the entire world, World War II is a happening. In the Middle East, the creation of Israel is a happening. So, when referring to modern life in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, the collapse of the Soviet Union is absolutely a happening. The Soviet Union was a state which constituted its power and formed during the collapse of the Russian Empire in the 1917 revolution, and cemented its power in the Russian Civil War that followed. It's important to remember that while the Soviet Union was the successor of the Russian Empire, and the Russian Federation is legally its successor organization in international organizations across the board, the Soviet Union was in no sense a Russian nationalist body. It was a confederation in which the various minorities of the Russian Empire before it were given rights and privileges over and above the Russian ethnic majority. After the Soviet Union cemented its power and came to victory in the Russian Civil War, and until the end of the Second World War, the Soviet Union would be an international pariah state. It was a socialist camp at war with the capitalist world in a millenarian struggle which it was fated to win according to Marxist doctrine. Within Marxist doctrine, capitalist states and their desire for empire make them inherent aggressors towards the socialist camp. The socialist camp was just as much as an aggressor, though, because they're seeking to foster international revolution throughout the world within the capitalist states themselves. After the Civil War, the Soviet Union became an armed camp, building its industry and military, waiting for what they viewed as an inevitable war with the capitalist powers. This war, I guess, in a sense, became the Second World War. While the fascist and other right-wing powers viewed the Soviet Union and their communism as the ultimate enemy, it was the liberal powers of the United States, the United Kingdom, and the French Third Republic, which had strained or no relations with the Soviet Union before the Second World War. But at the end of the Second War, the Soviet Union was able to conquer vast lands in Eastern Europe and Asia, and it ended up having full relations with these liberal powers that won when the fascist powers lost. Relations with these liberal powers brought on renewed trade with the largely between them and the largely autarkic Soviet Union, along with increased support for the communist movements occurring throughout the world, within the capitalist West and throughout their colonial countries and independent countries of that as well. There was this mass rise of support for communism, and it gained a lot of popularity. Some of this was, completely independent of the Soviet Union, and some of this was directly sponsored by the Soviet Union, both overtly and covertly. Importantly, the Soviet Union was able to expand its hard power after the Second World War, and it was an incredibly strong military power upon the world stage. Its borders moved westwards, taking territory from Finland, Poland, Germany, Romania, outright annexing Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and it was able to install client communist states, in Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, and North Korea. And it aided the communists in the Chinese Civil War and may have tipped the balance to create another communist great power in the form of Communist China, which exists to this day beyond the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. When creating these states, the Soviet Union imposed revolution on them top-down in Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union was clearly an occupying power, imposing these oppressive regimes primarily to serve its own goals rather than the hopes and goals of the indigenous populations of Eastern Europe and North Korea. And in doing so, the Soviet state created a great burden for itself. While it could now more readily project power globally and could reap economic advantages through these vassal states in the Comcon trade bloc, it was stuck with this terrible sunk cost because it had to maintain this empire abroad in Eastern Europe, which was very unpopular. These communist states were, as I said before, intensely unpopular and liable to spontaneous popular revolutions and mass civil disobedience, which required Soviet action 3 separate times within 44 years to put them down militarily. 1953 in East Germany, 1956 in Hungary, and 1968 in Czechoslovakia. A similar war broke out in Afghanistan in 1979 when a counter-coup overthrew a previous pro-Soviet coup that occurred in 1978 within Afghanistan, which when those communists were going down, it prompted a Soviet intervention in the country, which spiraled into an extremely costly and bloody war, the Soviet-Afghan War, which ended for the Soviet Union in 1989 and ultimately would end after the collapse of the Soviet Union itself in 1992. The Soviet Union was thus committed to this terrible cost of creating the largest army in history, the history of the world really, to occupy this vast swath of Eastern European territory. It could not abandon these territories either, though, since their cultural proximity to the Russian heartland of the Soviet Union meant that a successful rebellion within these Eastern European states will lead credibility to dissenters within the Soviet Union and jeopardize the stability of that country itself. The Soviet invasions of East Germany and Hungary and Czechoslovakia and ultimately Afghanistan to maintain communism were an explicit policy that the Soviets outlined through what's known as the Brezhnev Doctrine, in which the Soviet Union was going to have to put down any rebellion against a communist state with military force. It was not lost on the people of the world that these invasions in reality were just as imperial as any military action by any colonial power. For example, the military reaction by the Portuguese Empire towards colonies in Angola and Mozambique, or the French Empire in Vietnam or Algeria. The picture this drew of socialism, then, was an ideology which is imposed on a peripheral nation by a powerful outside empire, rather than some kind of popular ideology of the people which seeks to liberate them from the constraints of oppressive economic conditions, what socialism identifies itself as. So that's a contradiction at the heart of communism, which really delegitimized it as an ideology, because its lofty goals of earthly utopia were in reality seen to be this oppressive and contradictory system. The paradox of the Soviet Union existing as a socialist empire was only one of numerous paradoxes, though, that existed within the socialist system across the board. Another paradox of communism, or Marxist-Leninism, if you will, is how authoritarian it is. All Marxists and the official documents of every communist state stress that it is not simply democratic, but indeed it is a true democracy and far more representative of the people than the democracies we see within liberalism. And in a sense, they believe themselves to be a true participatory direct democracy. So according to Marxist theory, Soviet-style or council democracy is a mass democracy in which all organizations in a society are organized upon democratic lines, in which there are representatives of these directly elected councils called Soviets. These Soviets would then be represented in a single country-wide legislative body. In the case of the Soviet Union, the Congress of Soviets, which later became the Supreme Soviet. Each of the members of these councils, from the lowest to the highest, had to be a member of the sole legal party in the country, the Communist Party. This is where the term single-party state comes from. In the Communist Party, that's where the greatest power structure for the nation subsists, but there's actually a hierarchical constitutional hierarchy which exists outside of the Communist Party. There's these positions within the legislature and bureaucracy which are completely separate from the organization of the Communist Party itself. I like to call this distinction the de jure government versus the de facto government. The de jure government is the one that has these mandated positions which are supposed to legally be in charge. These official positions within the Soviet cabinet and within the Soviet legislature. And then there's these de facto positions, and that is where the real power is held, and that's the hierarchy of the Communist Party itself. So in every case, one, in order to climb the structure of power, must really be a member of the Communist Party. And the Communist Party, even if there's these positions outside of it, say like the president of the Soviet Union, the real power is the general secretary or head of the Communist Party. And in order to advance in your career to any higher level beyond kind of an introductory level, even becoming a mid-level manager, you really have to join the Communist Party to get anywhere. So advancement in the communist government, in the Soviet government, is rather like advancing in a corporate power structure, or advancement is achieved through connections outside of the formal structure within their connections in the hierarchical Communist Party structure. This dual division of power is seen most explicitly with there being a head of state or head of government within most Leninist states, but the real position of power isn't that position, but rather the head of the Communist Party, the general secretary of the Communist Party. The leadership of the Communist Party heads the Politburo of the Soviet Union, which is essentially like a cabinet in the United States for the president, and the cabinet answers to the general secretary. And so you have all these overlapping positions of the de jure state roles and positions within the Communist Party as its leadership. And so what ended up happening is that the Politburo is kind of like the Catholic Church college of electors, and the Soviet Union, in a sense then, with the Politburo, evolved in what you could say is an electoral monarchy type of government. Because what ultimately is the deciding factor in deciding the general secretary is who is a part of the Politburo, and the Politburo, on the death of a general secretary, elects among themselves the new general secretary, and then the general secretary will decide who becomes the members of the Politburo. The general secretary ruled the country as a centralized leader who had a great deal of discretionary power and who would reign until their death. He appointed members of the Politburo who then elected the successor from themselves. Here's this thing that you will see here, and is kind of a universal within all electoral monarchies, is that they kind of become this geronocracy, or rule of the old. The monarch rules on to his death, and then he selects his peers and proteges from younger people, but because they are selected at a younger age, they age up with the monarch before he dies. And so you just kind of have this aging spiral where the monarch themselves and everybody they select ages up. And then you have this selection bias where in order to control the power of any one monarch, you want to choose somebody who's old or near death. So outside of this natural progress process of aging, linked within the system, factions within the electors often choose compromise candidates, this is what I'm talking about, who are old and expected to die soon, and thus they're less capable of taking consequential action. And this prevents different factions within the Politburo or within the college that elects the monarch from really being able to push their power and punish the other. Is a kind of status quo which keeps the system rolling. The strength of an electoral policy then, or polity, is that it creates this stable system within electoral monarchy, which is not subject to generating these powerful independent leaders who would impose radical changes and put the system in danger. The downside with this type of government is that it will tend to not have these said leaders who have the ability to do such a thing and address problems and enact change which is needed. And so it puts a monarchy like that on this trajectory of stagnation, and that you have this stagnation of ideas that occurs. And you could say in the Catholic Church, this is actually a really good thing, is that it makes reform very difficult in the Catholic Church, because the purpose of the Pope is to defend orthodoxy and guide the faithful. If the Pope is kind of put off in his own insular world, and he's much older than the current generation, he's less likely to fall under the current trends of the current culture and be much more committed to, let's say, Catholicism in that case, or the true religion. The Mormon Church actually kind of runs this way as well. And so you have this sense to where the head of the Catholic Church or the head of the Mormon Church are kind of in their own world, multiple generations behind what's going on right now. And it kind of creates this stability which doesn't allow these organizations to fall into trends. Unfortunately, with Pope Francis and with Pope Leo, they are kind of this worse era of clergy, this Vatican II era. But even there, Francis and Leo XIV, they really aren't subject to, say, what's going on with popular culture with the Zoomers, for better or for worse. And they really aren't subject, and I'm talking like emotionally, they really aren't subject, like Paul VI and was not subject to the movements of the hippie generation. And so a leadership that has faster turnover, like the Anglican Church, and I'm not, like, we're talking outside of what God does to protect his own church. So let's talk about like the Anglican Church or the Southern Baptist Convention, because they have a much higher turnover of people in their leadership, and it's much faster and the people are much younger. There's been this falling into trends with those type of churches, much more so than with the Catholic Church or the Ecumenical Patriarch in the Eastern Orthodox Church, or with the leadership of the Mormon Church. So anyway, this also helped the Soviet Union because it kind of put them in this trajectory where the communism of the initial period of communism kind of is this nostalgic thing where the leadership of the Soviet Union isn't necessarily that affected with understanding the failure of communism after Stalin in creating high level of living standards. And so Brezhnev and the era of stagnation, we can really kind of see this as this kind of like era of neo-Stalinist nostalgia, which is like this own bubble, which is keeping the Soviet leadership pure despite the obvious failures of communism to achieve an earthly utopia. And so, talking about the reign of Brezhnev, who held power in the Soviet Union from the age of 57 to 75, with his health declining rapidly and his mental capacity to govern the country declining, you have this kind of like bubble effect, like I was saying. And then what happens after his death is that the Politburo selects two successors, which are sickly old men, which are going to keep the stability of the system. So the first successor is going to be the 67-year-old Andropov, who dies within 2 years. He was quite mentally capable, but he was on dialysis and had failing kidneys by the time that he was elected to the Politburo. And then the next one will be the 72-year-old Chernenko, who died within, I think, within a year after becoming premier and general secretary. So both of those are perfect example of this kind of thing of selecting somebody who is much older than the general population and is kind of insular within the general mindset of the Soviet Union's upper party leadership, and that they are not very capable of radical change. And all three of these people were completely unable to address the mounting problems of the Soviet Union and its empire. Brezhnev, of course, couldn't tackle these problems due to his declining mental state. Chernenko was in charge for too short of a period of time, and Andropov was again, he lived too short, and he was too physically sickly to tackle these problems. Andropov himself viewed himself as a reform-minded leader who was well aware of these problems that were mounting in the Soviet Union and its empire abroad. While he was mentally capable, he, again, like I said, was on dialysis during his short reign and died within 2 years. But his greatest contribution as a general secretary was actually to bring a younger reformer who was a generation younger than many of the other members of the Politburo at that time, Mikhail Gorbachev. While Andropov's wishes of selecting Gorbachev to be his successor immediately after his death were not fulfilled and Chernenko was elected, Chernenko only lasted so long, and ultimately Gorbachev would succeed Chernenko in 1985. The Soviet Union, which Gorbachev inherited, was racked with several systematic problems. While these problems were in many cases dire, at the same time, none of them, even if combined, if they were unchecked, would really result in the Soviet Union's collapse in retrospect if we look at them. Ironically, I think it's ultimately Gorbachev's meddling with the system and his very ill-advised reforms to try and save it. They're far more at fault here than any of these systematic problems that were starting to mount up during the stagnation period from Brezhnev taking control in 1968 until Gorbachev took control in 1985. Though it's important to know these stagnation problems do contribute to the ultimate collapse of the Soviet Union. Maybe that's not a strong topic definition, like topic sentence for such an essay as this, but as a historian, I really like hedging my bets on both sides, and this is what you'll get. Like, if you become deeper and deeper in being a historian, you eventually learn the necessity of trying to see all different perspectives from different events. So I'm sorry if it sounds kind of weak hedging my bets there, but I really do think that the reality is that the center of the collapse of the Soviet Union hinges upon Gorbachev as a individual actor within history, a true shit man of history. You could say there's these great men of history, you know, your Alexander the Great, your Napoleon, dare I say, your Hitler, your Nasser, your Tito even, your Stalin even, right? But I think that there's also these unique men who are focal points of history due to their incompetence, and I think they're shit men of history, and Gorbachev is a shit man of history. It's common knowledge that the Soviet Union's centrally planned socialist economy was incredibly inefficient. The Soviet Union had a highly controlled market which did not allow goods' true value to be assessed in relation for the demand for those goods. The Soviet bureaucracy simply produced goods in relation to what they believed the need for these goods was. So when this came to the military and the heavy industry in general, it wasn't really that problematic, and the Soviet Union was able to build this massive, capable military machine in its heavy arms industry. Its military goods and hardware were actually pretty profitable on the export, and they continue to do so through the transition of the collapse of the Soviet Union into the modern Russian Federation. And they're very high quality. You could say that compared to Western military hardware, right? Soviet hardware is less, maybe more crude oftentimes, but it's also extremely reliable, and you're getting your money for what you're getting. It is very cheap compared to how reliable it is and how capable it is. The military industry took up a substantial part of the Soviet economy, and the people of the Soviet Union were dependent upon this military buildup, economically speaking. Any reduction in arms production would and did result in massive economic consequences for the Soviet people. Mass unemployment and loss of state revenue. When it came to light industry and consumer goods, the Soviet Union was incredibly inefficient in providing these goods, which the people wanted for their day-to-day lives. There was almost always excess demand and shortages for consumer goods products. The goods which the Soviet Union did create in the sector were limited and often of lower quality compared to the goods from the Asian tiger economies in the West, led into an intense thirst for Western and East Asian imports of consumer goods within the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc at large. The Soviet agricultural industry was also inefficient with collective farms and central planning. Part of that has to do with the central government prioritizing heavy industry and urbanization in general throughout its history, but most of it has to do with having large, inefficient farms following bureaucratic dictates. The most productive sector of the Soviet agricultural sector was always actually farmers' own gardens, as they would eventually be allowed to grow their own privately managed gardens, which were subject to normal market processes. And these gardens, despite being only a fairly small part of the total cultivated land of the country, made a hugely disproportionate part of the Soviet agricultural sector. The Soviet Union overcame its shortcomings in consumer goods and agriculture by just trading for these products with natural resources outright internationally, in particular trading their oil and natural gas. The Soviets would sell oil and natural gas on the market and receive hard currency to pay for consumer and agricultural goods. Through the Brezhnev era, the Soviet Union was increasingly saw a higher standard of living, which was rising and brought on a lot of prosperity, but that was mostly from the importation of food and consumer goods from abroad, which was bought off the backs of oil and natural gas. Even if the increasing prosperity of the Soviet Union was less than the comparable to Western Europe, it still was something which brought the Soviet government a great deal of legitimacy and goodwill from the people. Growth is growth. Increasing living standards are increasing living standards. When speaking of the socialism here, it's important to remember that despite its inefficiencies, any cow which produces milk, even if that cow is kind of sickly, is better than any cow which doesn't produce milk at all. While the living standards of the Soviet Union were lower than that what they ought to be, considering some pretty good human capital, geography, and natural resources, the Soviet Union did provide many goods for its people, and so in the eyes of the majority of the people, it fulfilled the social contract and was a popular government. The guarantees of education, healthcare, and employment which the Soviet Union gave to its people, which were part of its socialist ideology, were incredibly popular. Likewise, the Soviet Union in the post-war years was a pretty peaceful place to be. And the destruction which Germany had wrought upon the nation, that was repaired. And even in this period of stagnation, or I should say through this entire period of stagnation, it was kind of this optimistic period of ever-increasing growth and high living standards getting better and better for the people. But there was also this downside to this, because there was also this general malaise and indifference within the work culture of the Soviet Union. The perennial knowledge to this is that when the system doesn't benefit somebody for giving their highest quality of work, and then they see that the people that put in minimal work get the same outcomes, that's going to definitely hurt the overall quality of work in some sense. It is kind of a gross simplification to say, everybody gets the same, so nobody's going to try hard, because, it wasn't exactly everybody got the same, but there's a great deal of truth to this, and that's what led to this malaise which overtook Soviet work culture. And you got to remember that this malaise is fed in by the fact that it's not that much of a meritocracy. It is a system of connections within the Soviet Union, personal connections there, which get your promotion. It's not your merit as a worker. And so if you had this kind of system, a socialist system, you would think would be the driver to make people work would be meritocracy. But in reality, the driver for advancement was connections within the de facto government, the Communist Party. And I think that is just as much a generator of the malaise within the workforce as any kind of everybody gets something equally kind of mentality, which is part of socialism and communism. Because you have this real disconnection of advancement in one's work life between the actual outcome of their work and what they're going to get in advancing. It's really your connection to the Communist Party, which is going to drive your higher level success and your advancement in kind of the corporate structure of Soviet society. An indicator of how much this malaise was a danger to society, I think, is that alcoholism became this rampant problem within Soviet society. And there was this intense drinking culture, which was having really direct effects on the life expectancy of the population. Alcoholism is, associated with a lot of negative knock-on effects throughout society because it's connected to domestic violence. It's connected to child abuse, and it's connected to drunk driving, among other problems. So when we speak of the malaise of Soviet society, we must remember that communism was vigorously opposed to any kind of spiritual, deeper understanding of our universe beyond materialism. The Soviet Union oppressed all religions and was officially atheist and promoted atheism. The ultimate goal and the ultimate end of society under Marxism is a material paradise, not heaven or some kind of divinely instructed world, but something that comes from within the earth and is brought about by human means. their utopia is anthrocentric. Marxism teaches that society is ever moving forwards and ever increasing in material prosperity, and that utopia is brought about by material advancement. And so as this occurs, the property relations of society are going to change towards ever more equality as there's ever greater technological capacity. And so the various divisions between classes of society will grow less and less harsh until you reach, a full communism where everybody has their needs met and there's no deprivation of any material goods or needs for anybody. As we advance into the ultimate classless society, the social consciousness of the world will also increase, alleviating, kind of like these natural social ills that Christians would say come from our sinful nature, because they view sinful ills, stuff like alcoholism, right, adultery, and, murder, just crime, antisocial behavior, that the real problem for this is economic inequality. And so as economic inequality is going to lessen, then all social ills will lessen due to this rise of social consciousness. So there's no real doubt that full communism, as expressed within Marxism, is a very utopian and millenarian vision. Ultimately, though, what is offered by socialism is not simply equality, but on the ground level, material prosperity. It was clearly evident that this economic system that the Soviet Union had built with its inefficiencies was resulting in a general lack of material prosperity, at least against the liberal system of the American bloc and against the other European powers. Russia is, of course, a European people and a European power. And so this paradox, I think, cuts foundationally at the legitimacy of the Soviet system and all socialist systems. And I think that undermines the attraction of the communist ideology over time if you actually live in a communist state, because the ultimate goal that Marxism tells you is that the outcome of monarchism, my nose gets stuffed up during these videos, and so it blocks off my ability to fully vocalize vowels sometimes. So anyway, the Marxist system is sold on material prosperity, and it says that it's this scientific way to create prosperity. But the reality, once you live in it for a few decades, you can see is it doesn't generate prosperity. The elite's loyalty in that system was rewarded with special material benefits to keep them loyal. And the Soviet and Eastern European elites became this nomenclatura class of these people that are rewarded through their loyalty to the system with higher prosperity. The nomenclatura were a corrupt class who could receive many benefits due to their higher positions in society, which was not afforded to the populace, the general populace. This class was able to shop in secret stores in which they could purchase high-quality imports, more readily receive this harder-to-find foodstuffs, and they were allowed to operate black market businesses, sometimes with impunity. The desire for socialism before the revolution took place was heightened by this millenarian promise of what socialism would do once it was in action. The idea that all the woes of society can be fixed by redistributing wealth and power, and a much better world lies beyond this revolution, that's an intoxicating promise. But once that revolution takes place and is enshrined by law into a formal system, then this millenarian promise fades away into the reality, which is this mundane day-to-day life. A day-to-day reality of a post-revolutionary government, and the promises of future material prosperity, they're just unrealized dreams. And even the dreams of equality, they're a myth themselves. At that point, the appeal of radical socialist politics fades, and socialism in and of itself has no legitimacy. Without this legitimacy, this youthfulness that you'll always see within leftism, this idealism for achieving this material equality that you see universally, this is why you have this sense that leftists are young and that they have this vitality, that goes away. And so as time goes on, these new generations are going to be less and less committed to this revolution, and the revolution's transgressions against the natural law of the world. Those who were committed at the onset, they're going to maintain their power, but those born after the revolution, they're going to have a faint interest, if any at all, in achieving the goals of that revolution, because they see that it was a hollow promise. They're not going to participate in the state and its official organs in a truly ideological or ideal way. They're going to function in it in a much more pragmatic way. And so the government in turn at the top is going to become increasingly older with this bubble of ideological, true committed socialists. This is true in the Soviet Union as it is true with the liberal hierarchy in the United States. You can see that most of the Democratic Party is significantly older than the current generations, and that there's this always kind of like weird thing in socialism where you have this kind of like ancient Bernie Sanders type leader. And even when socialism is able to appeal to the young, like with Bernie Sanders, there's still this cult of this ancient, like bubbleized leader. Gerontocracy, I think, is something which really eats away and underwrites the legitimacy of socialism. And I think that outside of kind of the stabilizing effects of keeping the system together, it also contributed to undermining the legitimacy of the Soviet system overall. Socialism cannot endure as a vibrant, flourishing ideology in this type of context. And so its only meaningful purpose once it takes power is the promise of material prosperity, and something which it can never bring because of its inherent inefficiencies. People are willing to take deprivation in prosperity for the sake of God. They're willing to take it for the sake of their children, for a better future for their children, and they're willing to take it for the sake of their people and their nation. They're not willing to take deprivation on the behalf of an ideology which is promising prosperity. Once in power, then, the socialist regime cannot bank on its original appeal to the people, and the basis of their revolutionary promises instead must be abandoned, and they have to find some kind of new reason to generate legitimacy. And if they can't, all that they really have to keep themselves in power is violence. Thus, paradoxically, the Marxist globalist international intention to abolish countries ends up creating this kind of weird neo-nationalism, because the only thing that's holding people together within the countries without God is their common identity as people. And so you see, once socialism is established, despite it being this left-wing thing, you see this reemergence of nationalism, whether if that's in a kind of like ethnically homogeneous state like Juche in North Korea, or it's in kind of like the civic nationalism which would develop during Stalin's regime, or the nationalism which ultimately contributes to the collapse of Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union itself. And so that couldn't happen in the Eastern European client regimes for the Soviet Union. And that was because they were installed top-down by the Soviets on them. And so while in the Soviet Union there could be this kind of civic nationalism that held the system together, and that there's this nationalism we see in China and in North Korea and in Vietnam, in these communist states that continue to this day, there was never this civic nationalism or this outright nationalism in like Juche that's able to develop in Eastern Europe outside of the Soviet Union proper. And so in their case, the only thing that could help prop up the regimes in Poland or in East Germany or in Czechoslovakia was fear and violence. And so that really led to this ticking time bomb, because Eastern Europe is this gigantic sunk cost fallacy for the Soviet Union. And the only way that they can keep it is through military commitment and occupation indefinitely. Leaving ideology and meta-history, let's return to the history of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev was elected to be General Secretary in 1985, following the death of Chernobyl. Gorbachev had been Andropov's favored successor to usher in reform to the stagnating Soviet system. He, of course, did not directly succeed Andropov as Andropov would have wished, but ultimately he did, because after Chernenko's rapid death and the death of 3 general secretaries in just as many years, the Politburo wanted to have somebody younger, and so they turned to their youngest member, a 54-year-old Gorbachev, to leave the country. Gorbachev was not a radical reformer, I would say, out of the gate. The first reforms that Gorbachev enacted were restrictions upon alcohol. Alcoholism had long been a scourge of Russian society at this point. The Soviets attempted 3 times to have anti-alcohol campaigns, with the third and furthest reaching campaign occurring now during Gorbachev's premiership. While this campaign was not a full-on prohibition, it did enact laws which limited sales in stores to a certain amount of inconvenient hours for people, and it also raised the price of alcoholic drinks. The result was a massive decline in wine and beer output, and it cost the opposite of what you would have wanted, a shift towards the use of vodka, cognac, and other spirits which could be more readily manufactured and traded through the black market. The shift away from beer and wine towards hard liquor meant that the alcohol that was being consumed was more likely to be more powerful and would make the effects of alcoholism worse. Outside of traditional spirits, bootleg alcohol would be made out of things like windshield cleaner and cleaning alcohol, which resulted in people dying. Vodka was also a key source of tax revenue within the socialist system itself, and when it was banned, it deprived the Soviet Union of that key tax revenue, and it kind of really hurt their economy. And this was one of the things that would hurt their economy going forward with the economic catastrophe that was perestroika. In 1989, it's believed that ending this tax on alcohol deprived the state of 91.8 million rubles. I shouldn't say ending the tax. Withholding this consumption that could be taxed, I should say, would be a better way to say it. But anyway, it deprived the state of 91.8 million rubles of revenue out of an income of some 459 million rubles. In 1990, this program would be discontinued, but a lot of damage had been done by that point. When Gorbachev came to power in 1985, He was surrounded by many ministers and Politburo members who had entrenched power bases. Gorbachev would need to carefully sidestep them and to contain those who would have been more critical of the radical reforms he intended in the years to come. And so he was pretty cautious at the beginning, and he worked towards only having moderate reforms and being able to kind of put the people that would have been critical of him in their place before he can move on to more radical reforms. It always takes a leader years to cement power behind themselves. But with Gorbachev, I think that he was gifted with a certain series of crises which allowed him to do this faster than most leaders are ever capable of doing it, and to a much higher and more thorough amount than many other leaders. And just one of the things that really helped him, again, was he was 54 and most of the other members of the Politburo were older than him. So even without the crises, he could also age them out. Andrei Gromyko had been foreign minister since 1957 and had essentially guided the entirety of Soviet foreign policy without the input of anybody else as the general secretary who would be capable enough to push him in any other direction. And so he kind of just ran it on his own from Brezhnev's stroke from 1975 onwards. Gorbachev was able to replace him with Edward I'm stuck at this Georgian name. Edward Shevardnadze in 1985, and that was only a few months after taking power. Gorbachev still had to keep Gromyko in the Politburo, though, when he did this. You got to remember that Khrushchev had been removed from power as general secretary in 1964 by other Politburo members that didn't like him, and so he was forced into retirement. And Gorbachev knew that he could be removed from power, so he had to be really cautious. Ultimately, that didn't happen to Gorbachev, and Gromyko was dead by 1989. And by that point in time, many other members of this high governing party had also passed away. So Gorbachev was really able to just replace them with his own men as they naturally faded away, and that helped him cement his own power. I think what's more important, though, than this natural aging process were two separate crises which Gorbachev exploited brilliantly. While I do think Gorbachev is a shit man of history, if you will, he is very good at maneuvering within the Soviet system. He's a very good politician, even if he's a shit man of history that kind of is this fulcrum point of an individual in charge of failure. He was not without his talents, and he really knew how to exploit a crisis in order to gain political capital from it. So this first crisis was the Chernobyl disaster, the most infamous, not just nuclear disaster, but perhaps environmental disaster in human history. And that happened pretty early on because he became General Secretary in March of 85, and so by the time of April 26, 1986, Reactor 4 of Chernobyl explodes. This was from a faulty design, and Reactor 4 exploded and irradiated much of the nearby town Pripyat, and the authorities ultimately had to evacuate this large swath of land in northern Ukraine and southern Belarus, which became the exclusion zone. The news media controlled by the authoritarian Soviet government did not initially tell the public how severe the incident that happened at Chernobyl was, but it did not really react at all. It didn't really react enough to protect the citizens from radiation exposure. While the town of Pripyat was evacuated the next day, the central government didn't really acknowledge to the general public what had happened until April 28th. So that was 2 days later. Many Soviet citizens who didn't already trust their government were turning to radio programs from Eastern Europe and Western Europe to know the scale of what had occurred. Nuclear technology has always been subject to a lot of unfounded fear and extreme exaggeration in its dangers, but the public all over Europe kind of took on to this exaggeration, and it kind of got out of control. It ended up in not millions, but tens of thousands of Western European women ultimately had abortions, and when asked why they did so, elective abortions, and said that they were afraid of the Soviet radiation from Chernobyl causing their children to have birth defects. So you have this problem where the Soviet media is viewed as untrustworthy because it's not saying what's happening at the time, maybe even to calm the Soviet people, but it backfires because the Soviet people are turning to the Western media, which is often anti-nuclear for political reasons, like the German Green Party, and they're just completely out of control and exaggerating the supposed danger of nuclear power and nuclear technology, and that's just kind of making the system worse and making the Soviet people distrust the government even more than they ought to. This wasn't really helped by the massive scale of what the Soviet Union did to curtail the problem of Chernobyl. Having such a huge area of an exclusion zone really didn't help. I mean, in retrospect, we now know that you could probably just live in the exclusion zone, that all the Soviet estimates, let alone like European Green Movement's estimates about the damage from Chernobyl, isn't just exaggerated. It's like it's like an order of magnitude exaggerated. But these like massive movements that they're doing, and that they're having like everything is fine guys kind of media presence going on where you can't question it because there's no open media, it really undermined the legitimacy of the government. The effects of the Chernobyl disaster were not immediately apparent, I think, at that time, but Gorbachev himself has retroactively said that the disaster is what caused him personally to lose faith in the Soviet system as it had existed to that point in time. I think when he's saying that, what he's talking about is this culture of lying, which the Soviet media and the Soviet system just kind of relies on to overcome its shortcomings. And when you're talking about the industrial system of over-exaggerating quotas, that's one thing. I mean, it got to the point where the central government of the Soviet Union is using spy satellites, military spy satellites, right, to measure wheat harvests in Central Asia because of how unreliable the lower downs are in exaggerating output. But when it's a lot worse when you're talking about lying about this perceived disaster that these scientists are exaggerating and saying puts the whole human race into danger from radiation. And the problem here is you have a big problem economically when you're talking about, Uzbek wheat. But what ended up happening is that this culture of lying and this culture of sweeping problems or minor issues under the rug is what caused this graphite thing. Because what happened is that what stopped the spike leading to a nuclear explosion that was going out of control was this graphite tipped mechanism. I'm not a nuclear scientist, but what stops the reactor from going out of control is this graphite tipped mechanism. But the graphite caused the reaction to amplify. And so this faulty mechanism got swept under the rug during this culture of lying. And so the very culture of lying and within the Soviet industrial system is what could be said to have led into the Chernobyl disaster. That disaster was the greatest in the Soviet Union since the famine of 1946, 1945, the post-war famine after World War II, when America withdrew its food subsidies. This shook Soviet confidence in their system, I think, across the board. And the Soviet confidence in their government and public trust was just on a downward spiral as Gorbachev began to liberalize the system. And as Gorbachev's liberalization destroyed the economy, it just kept spiraling and spiraling out of control. And Gorbachev used Chernobyl and this limited sharing of information due to the top-down nature of the Soviet media apparatus to push for liberalization of the media and free speech, and that's what became Glasnost. The influence of Chernobyl upon the collapse of the Soviet Union and Gorbachev's movement towards liberalism and social democracy, though, outside of these kind of like retroactive stuff, it's like, that's when I lost hope in the Soviet Union and I lost hope in the system, right? These 2020 hindsight comments from Gorbachev, it's a little difficult to directly chart, but there is an incident that he exploited which is a lot more one-to-one direct in how it allowed Gorbachev to get a free hand in changing up the Soviet government system and shaking up the higher echelons of power towards what he wanted them to be. And so this incident occurred on May 28th, 1987, where a West German pilot, commercial pilot, flew a small private plane. The name of the pilot was Matthias Rust, and he flew from Helsinki, Finland, into Moscow. And he would ultimately land this small plane on a bridge just outside of the Kremlin, in Moscow. And so this was like God wanted this to happen or something. This was such a unique incident, or black swan incident, because this incident occurred on Border Guards Day. It was like this public holiday that the Soviet Union had where they would celebrate the border guards, and so that meant that the border guards in the country and the total border security, most of it was off on holiday. But further than that, though, both civilian and military air traffic controllers detected this flight, but they did nothing to intercept or prevent Rust from doing what he was doing. But with the Border Guard Day kind of thing, there are outside factors, like special historical factors, that let Rust and being able to do what he did. In 1983, there was the Korean Airlines disaster, Flight 007, if you will. And this was a flight that went to New York, stopped in Anchorage, and was going to end up in Seoul. And what it did along the way is it went over on accident over Soviet airspace. And this is September 1st, 1983. And the Soviet air defenses ended up shooting down the civilian airliner and killed 246 passengers and 23 crew. This was one of the most major events in terms of people actually dying in the Cold War. And it was occurring at a very intense period during the Cold War, the early Reagan period before Gorbachev came to power after the intervention in Afghanistan. There was several incidents that occurred in this period. There was, of course, the Able Archer incident of military planning by NATO, causing the Soviets to think that it was some kind of like ruse to have this plan, and that they were faking the planning and the military exercises in order to invade outright the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact. And there was the American stationing of the Polaris missiles in Western Europe. And there was all this stuff that was going on that was really intensifying the Cold War. And so it kind of contributed to the Soviet Air Force and the Soviet air defense force being so aggressive that they would shoot down the civilian airliner. And it was this horrible disaster in terms of the Soviet Union's public image. And so after that, it's clear that you would see that they would be very reluctant to shoot down any kind of civilian airliner. And so that's what happens in the Rust case. And so ultimately, Rust was able to penetrate into the very core of the Soviet Union itself. Gorbachev proved incredibly decisive immediately upon this incident, and he used it as his casus belli to dismiss numerous Soviet higher officers from duty, effectively allowing him to basically purge the officer corps Stalin style without actually killing anybody. And that meant that the military wasn't able to be this bastion of resistance towards any kind of radical reforms. His dismissals included the Minister of Defense, Sergei Sokolov, Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Air Defense Forces, Alexander Koldanov, and just several others. And this was really, I think, the event that made him able to reform the way that he wanted to. Before all this, Gorbachev was making calls to reform the Soviet economy early in his premiership, but after the Rust incident, that allowed him to centralize power and to start the radical reforms that he had wanted. And so he begins the perestroika, or the rebuilding or restructuring of the Soviet economy. So in July of 1987, the law on state enterprise was passed by the Soviet legislature, the Supreme Soviet, which formally began perestroika. This law allowed state enterprises to determine their output based on what they believed the demand to be, but it did not allow for market forces to actually take effect because price controls would remain in the economy. The amount of goods manufactured could be lowered or technically increased in accordance with what it was thought would actually be the demand. And state enterprises were then supposed to be self-managed in regards to the cost of manufacturing. So there was this ability to adjust supply, but there was no ability to truly understand what the demand was on a deeper level, or for demand to really adjust in any way in accordance with the supply that was there. So the result was that the amount of goods created purposefully began to decline as manufacturers still didn't have the ability to profit because of the strict price controls. This meant that widespread shortages would begin to pervade the Soviet Union across the board from that point on. And this led to a rapid decline in the standard of living, but also kind of like a full-scale economic collapse and depression as it kept going for years and years without any kind of correction from the Soviet leadership. While the citizens of Soviet Union before had been used to shortages of supplies and rationing, which is endemic to any kind of centralized system, the severe decline in living standards again had not been felt since the famine of 1946, the famine of 1947. The entire post-war period after that point, the Soviet people had seen this ever-increasing rising standard of living. And that's what they had grown accustomed to, and that was what they expected. The decline in the standard of living, which was pretty fierce, then was seen throughout society and added to this decline in popular support for the government. Particularly hard hit during this was the Soviet agricultural sector, which always was notoriously poorly run and ineffective. With this new insane economic climate, food production began to decline and the threat of famine began to emerge again for the first time since that post-World War II famine, when the Soviet system underwent shock when Lend-Lease ended. The Soviet Union had become accustomed in the Brezhnev era to use oil and natural gas to trade directly for hard currency in order to buy food on the international market to pad out the shortcomings of the Soviet agricultural sector. This was this long-time safety valve that they were able to use so that the Soviet economy could keep coasting along. But the United States strategically formed this oil glut during this period to undermine this advantage and cause friction within the Soviet economy, as it engineered a drop of the price of oil internationally. By the 1980s, and the reasoning for this is that by the 1980s, advances in oil extraction technology had allowed for offshore drilling to become a real thing and to compete with traditional oil extraction. So oil extraction expanded into the North Sea with Norway and Scotland, and expanded into the Gulf of Mexico. These new discoveries also allowed for an increase of production in nations that were outside of the traditional OPEC nations, which had grown to dominate the oil industry in the first half of the Cold War. Countries such as the United States, the Soviet Union, Brazil, Egypt, India, Malaysia, and Oman began to become real players in the global oil industry. Finally, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states had this deeper strategy to deliberately increase their oil output in order to cannibalize their own profits for geopolitical reasons. They did this in order to deprive oil revenue for the hostile nation states towards them. And it wasn't just the Soviet Union, but it's really going to hurt the Soviet Union. It was also towards Islamist Iran after 1979 and Saddam's Iraq that this was geared towards. The thought was that Iraq, this pretty hostile power, which is revisionist, if you deprive their advantage in oil, then they're not going to be as economically capable. Iran, which is this pariah state after the Islamic Revolution in 1979, if you deprive their oil, they're going to be less capable. And indeed, the Soviet Union, with its weakness in its agricultural industry, which it kind of papers over with its oil trade, if you deprive that, then the Soviet Union is going to have real problems. And so the limiting of the Soviets' supply for oil, to trade oil, its ability to do so, was making another famine in the modern Soviet Union a real possibility. And it was something that Gorbachev did not want, and something which the Soviet leadership would do anything to avoid. That the biggest contribution that the United States had towards the collapse of the Soviet Union really is the fostering of this oil glut. The increased military spending of the United States, on the other hand, didn't really have any impact or correlation with the decline of the Soviet Union. I think that that's just mythology that the neoconservative movement uses to justify itself, and to justify the United States' own military buildup, both at that time and afterwards. Because the reality of the fact is that the Soviet Union's military buildup was one of the things that helped its economy. Heavy industry, and in particular military industries, have certain advantages under central planning. Indeed, the Soviet Union's economic system resembles the way that most their peacetime economy is very similar to the way that almost all industrial economies end up being run during wartime conditions. While a much larger share of the Soviet economy was taken up by its arms industry than the share of the American economy was taken up by its arms industry, I think that that's kind of a misnomer to say that the American arms industry was really stretching the Soviet economy to its brink. It's kind of the opposite. The American arms industry, it was really specialized in private industries, so you can't really compare private industries with defense contracts. So you can't really compare apples to apples here, because they're two completely different systems. Much of the Soviet arms industry, on the other hand, it was dispersed across the Soviet economy, and that the same industry which created arms created civilian goods. And so despite there being a centrally planned system, or despite huge advantages for the civilian structure and people wanting to work in the arms industry in the Soviet Union. And so there was no pushback within the Soviet Union against the arms industry the way that there would be with like the peace lobby in the United States and all that. The reality is that they're just completely difficult, and you can't take them one-to-one and directly compare them, because on paper the Soviet arms industry was a much larger proportion of its total economy. The reality is that the arms industry of the Soviet Union is not just the arms industry, it's the heavy industry of the Soviet Union at large, and a lot of civilian products are being created by the the military industry in a way that they're not in the United States. Part of this has to do with the American peace lobby itself. People get very up in arms with any kind of company investing in the military, and so there's kind of like pressure groups and stuff like that. I know that right now even people are trying to leave Spotify and boycott it because the leader of the company, he's involved in the arms industry and he's pro-Israel. And so they're against Spotify, not because of its very extreme negative impact on the music industry and the quality of music which is able to become popular in the United States and the Anglosphere at large. They're against it because its connection to the arms industry. And so the result is that the American arms industry is kind of very... I mean, there's other counterexamples like with, Boeing making civilian airliners, but the reality is the military industry in the United States is very specialized compared to the military industry that was in the Soviet Union. The historians who support this neoconservative and pro-Reagan narrative rely on that false equivalency and that misunderstanding to push their point. It must be stated that the Soviet arms industry was a very popular and very sought-after place for people to work domestically. So there wasn't any interior uproar, to the same extent at least, to any kind of military buildup or allocation of resources in the Soviet Union in the way that there was in the United States domestically. And so the Soviet Union was much more able to absorb the cost over the over-allocation of resources in central planning to its arms industry by just buying consumer goods outright with hard currency when it sold its natural resources and weapons on the international market. So the Soviet Union could just kind of increase its armed industry indefinitely, and it could just kind of eat the cost with natural resources or selling those arms itself to buy food or buy, VHS tape players from other countries. With this oil glut, though, the Soviet Union wasn't able to lose its natural resources to absorb these costs anymore. But it could still do that when it dealt arms. And so, if anything, the oil glut could push a more rational leader than Gorbachev to double down on the arms industry, because that would be an economic way out of the oil glut and the consequences which it's doing for the Soviet economy. Gorbachev was not a very level-minded or rational leader. He was not a pragmatist here. The Soviet Union's occupation and arming of Eastern Europe came at a great cost to the Soviet Union, of course, and much of its international arms shipments to countries outside of the Warsaw Pact were to key allies like Cuba or Vietnam. And so it wasn't that good of an economic enterprise when we speak about the gifting of it to other communist countries. So, yes, there is this element that the military buildup is bad or negative on the Soviet economy, but that mostly comes from the need to keep occupying Eastern Europe. When it's able to sell its weapons to non-Eastern Bloc countries for profit, that's beneficial. So what the Soviet Union ultimately does is Gorbachev moves it in this direction of reducing arms shipments and reducing its military across the board without any kind of consideration of this, purely for ideological needs. And that's because he abandoned the Marxist-Leninist idea of class struggle occurring not just within a nation, between the different classes there, but between nations, between the worker states and the capitalist states. And he ideologically moves into like this post-communist, globalist secular humanism, and really gets enmeshed personally in the international peace movement. The law on state enterprise was not the only radical law which changed a lot of stuff in the Soviet Union as part of perestroika. The law on cooperatives passed in 1988 mirrored the practices of the new economic policy of the 1920s, and that the law allowed for limited private ownership of businesses in some service and light industries. That's the way I wrote it. Anyway, foreign investors were allowed to have joint ventures with Soviet ministries as well under this law. Gorbachev's goal here was to attract investment from Western nations in order to have them integrate in the Soviet economy, and to have the Soviet economy integrate with the overall European market. The end of the military buildup in Europe and the occupation of the Warsaw Pact nations was kind of this gamble on Gorbachev's part. He was shutting off his military expenditure for ideological reasons, but there was also this idea that if he cut back on them, even to the third world, outside of like gifting it to Eastern Europe, that it would make the Soviet Union a lot more of a place to invest in for the liberal economy of Western Europe. And so he would allow Eastern Europe to liberalize and drop it and kind of incorporate Warsaw Pact into the developing European Union structure. But when reviewing the policies of perestroika, one must understand that these policies are developed in a country which had a culture of central planning, and due to its socialist ideological education, a lot of people didn't really understand how markets or capitalism were supposed to work and how they should model themselves, say, after the economies of Western Europe. They kind of just had this kind of cargo cult mentality that if they liberalized, they wouldn't need to kind of like guide it there, that it would just kind of work on its own in a kind of cargo cult. And so they didn't really know how to guide the economy into becoming a Western European modern developed economy. And they kind of just did these reforms willy-nilly, and they weren't moving quickly on the reforms either. Once they made them and it was obvious that there was a problem going on, they kind of just kept them and let them get worse and worse. And so these reforms were ill-advised, and they're kind of built on ignorance of economic reality. And a lot of them are pushed for political or ideological goals rather than any kind of realistic understanding of how free market economies really work. The economic policies of perestroika forced state enterprises to work as if they were a company in a market system which had to sustain itself without allowing that said company to gain profit by setting its own prices. The result was economic devastation. At the same time, the Soviet Union willingly deprived itself of two major forms of revenue, the first being taxation for alcohol, and the second being international arms shipments. And this is at the same time where there's this global oil glut that meant that they couldn't rely on oil or natural gas. The Soviet Union then rapidly bankrupted itself and began to depend upon international shipments of foodstuffs, which they didn't have the resources to buy. Thus, the state risked a created famine, again out of their incompetence. And this attempted economic liberalization which had been done to increase the Soviet standard of living, was backfiring. We're just going to lean into the reality that perestroika is going to be compared to China's socialism with Chinese characteristics. It's just inevitable that you're going to end up doing that. The Soviet model was a failure, as we all know, and the Chinese model was an extreme success. I think that perhaps the most important difference when understanding that is that the Chinese were abandoning price controls gradually, and the Chinese were more willing to work and adjust things as things went on, and that they're significantly more pragmatic in what they were doing. And the Soviets, they never abandoned price controls the entire time. The Chinese were far less aggressive in their transition, like I said before, and that transition took over a very long course of time, while Gorbachev kind of just pushed everything through in 2 years. While both the Soviet Union and China were capable, as we've seen with the modern Russian Federation, of moving from central planning towards a more market-oriented economy, I think that China's potential for immediate economic growth was a lot greater than that of the Soviet Union. And that has to do with China being much more open to Western investment. There's just this natural ability for the West to intervene in China far more than there is with the Soviet Union. And the reasoning for that is that China, that the United States after Nixon was hedging on the Sino-Soviet split between the Soviet Union and China. And so Western investors, if they invested in China, it wasn't a direct threat in the way that the Soviet Union was, especially the Western Europe. Even to this day, even before the invasion of Ukraine, Western Europeans are Russophobic, that there's this natural fear of Russia and that there's this natural fear of the Soviet Union. And so any kind of outside investment in the Soviet system is kind of dead on arrival. And Gorbachev, his plan is kind of like this insane gambit, because he's going to try and abandon Eastern Europe and cut down on his military. And cutting down on his military is going to hurt his own economy, with the idea that if he abandons Eastern Europe and cuts down on his military and deliberately destroys his own military, by the way, outside of the whole arms industry thing, cutting down on his military is a bad idea because the military is a massive employer. If you're this armed camp, you really don't want to cut down on your military very quickly. Even if people are, forcibly enlisted in it, you want to gradually cut back your military, because when you immediately shrink your military, you're laying off hundreds of thousands of people overnight. And so it's just a bad idea, full stop, to shrink your military over a very short period. But his gambit is to abandon Eastern Europe, to trade that for investment from Western Europe. That's his grand strategy. But the problem there, which I've talked about over and over and over again, is that Eastern Europe, because of its cultural proximity, and many of the states which they're controlled in Warsaw Pact by the Soviet Union are Slavic states. And so them moving towards liberalism is going to incentivize and inspire the civilians that are dissidents against the Soviet system within the Soviet Union to act. And by just abandoning Eastern Europe, you're making yourself weak. So Gorbachev really has this gambit of exposing his greatest weakness for something that's not going to happen, because Western Europe, even at its peak, right, in the 2000s, and early Putin, when Western Europe thought that Putin was going to be a real liberal, and Germany's investment in oil and all that, it's still not the amount that Western Europe and that the world invested in China from 1978 on, until it's starting to
go down a little bit after COVID and after Xi took power. But there are other reasons outside of that, beyond this kind of Western European fear or American fear and hatred of Russia that they just don't have for China. The other thing is that China's starting at the bottom is this very agriculturalized society. The Soviet Union of 1987 is already this highly industrialized nation. And while it attempted at autarky, it was still the people in the Soviet Union expected to work industrial jobs. So during the 1980s and the 70s, Western Europe is going to move towards offshoring its own industry. And Japan too. They're going to move towards that. And the Soviet Union depends on onshore industry, right? That they're this highly industrial place. And their labor just isn't cheap enough in order to offshore stuff into the Soviet Union proper in the same way that it is in China. And so what happens is that after 1991, the Soviet industry that existed when put on the world market, the labor is artificially inflated by the previous Soviet system and kind of shielded by Soviet autarky, like as a kind of super protectionism. And so when that falls down in free trade in the 1990s, the Soviet Union just kind of deindustrializes and collapses. So the investment that did occur in China, with China on the verge of industrialization, allowing all this free labor to be invested in these Western firms and Japanese firms and Singaporean firms and so on in China with their cheap labor, that same cheap labor is not available within the Soviet Union. And so this kind of like export-driven model of industrialization that China jumped on, it just does not apply to the Soviet Union at all. So the Soviet Union's liberalization and the Russian Federation's liberalization and the constituent Soviet states' eventual liberalization, they're just two completely different things. And that Gorbachev could have never done the type of liberation that Deng Xiaoping was able to accomplish. Gorbachev's reforms, despite how thoroughly, or perhaps because of how thoroughly he was able to cement his power, were not conducted cautiously or orderly like the reforms were in Deng Xiaoping's China. They occurred all at once. Right on the track of perestroika came Glasnost, or transparency of the government. This meant the establishment of free speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, and the right to assemble and protest. You have to remember, throughout the entire world and throughout all of human history, the clearest thing that's going to result in a government being popular is a well-managed economy. Governments who are perceived as managing their economy well are going to be popular. Even communist governments that are behind the West, like Brezhnev's, if it's growing in some sense and living standards are rising, that's going to make it popular. If you are causing living standards to go down, you're going to be unpopular. That's just the rules of the universe. So the policies of Glasnost, they opened up the government for public criticism for the first time in the Soviet Union. This is occurring when they have engineered an economic catastrophe, which is through ignorance, through negligence, through malice, and that's going to open up the leadership of the Soviet Union to be extremely unpopular in a very short course of time. You know, if you liberalized your economy and you caused a depression, well, at least if people couldn't talk about it openly, you could fix it without that intensive criticism. But once you open yourself up to intense criticism, it's just going to spiral out of control, and that's what happened. Those who wanted reform and said that this reform was not enough, they would be bolstered. because of freedom of speech. Those minorities that wanted independence, they could point towards the collapsing economy and use it as a way to push for their independence, which they weren't before. And communist hardliners that know this is failing, they now have the ability to criticize the government when they did not before. When Gorbachev's reforms are failing, people couldn't criticize Gorbachev from a communist perspective either. So Glasnost did not simply open up the current leadership to criticism, it also opened up the entire history of the Soviet state to criticism. And so every single atrocity that the Soviets ever committed, that was starting to be aired up. And so Gorbachev, despite separating himself from communism, by opening up criticism to the Soviet Union in general through free speech, meant that him as a leader was now going to be connected to the mass killings of Stalin, to the mistreatment of the minorities by the Russian majority, the putting down of the Russian majority on behalf of the minorities, the kind of affirmative action empire stuff, and the collaboration of the Soviet Union with the Axis empires and the Soviet Union's own atrocities during the Second World War. The Soviet leadership in particular was extremely protective of that reality, protective to a fault even of the Catalan massacre. The Soviet Union didn't just bury up the Catalan massacre or didn't allow people to talk about it, say like the Chinese did with the Tiananmen Square. The Catalan massacre is when they just wholesale took prisoners when they invaded Poland in 1939, and they wholesale took prisoners of officers, the Polish officer corps, and just wiped out the entire Polish officer corps. They just killed all of them to colonize Poland. And so, with the Tiananmen Square massacre to this day, China just says it didn't happen, right? Well, the Soviet Union made the situation worse because instead of saying the Catan, I'm saying Catalan, I'm adding an L into it, and I'm mispronouncing, guys. You just gotta know me, by the way, by this point in time. But anyway, the Catan massacre was made worse because the Soviet Union didn't just deny its existence, they blamed it upon their enemy, Germany. So they're at double duty. They're not just obfuscating the truth or even denying, they are making up a false reality to defend their crimes. And the other thing about, the Stalin atrocities and the atrocities of the Civil War and everything is that, unlike with the Holocaust, historians are willing to discuss the extent of what happened and the nature of what happened. But, what the Soviet public got during this time is going to be, fallacious, bits and pieces, exaggerated, the black book of communism tier bad history. And so what Gorbachev did by unleashing Glasnost is that he is pinning this legacy of all these Soviet atrocities which are coming out, the realization of them. I mean, the Soviet people knew in bits and pieces beforehand that there were bad things that happened, obviously, or anecdotally knew. But now there's this explosion of coverage over everything bad that happened since 1917. And so the whole entire economy, or the whole entire perception of the government is going to be tied up with every single atrocity that it ever committed at this time. And so, as Gorbachev is becoming more and more unpopular, unfairly I should say, the shadow of Stalin and the shadow of Lenin and their bad things that they did is going to become his own thing that he has ownership of, and something which he cannot take away. And so the radicals that want to form the system and move it towards true democracy, because Gorbachev is the leader of the country. He represents the Soviet past. And so somebody that's coming up new outside of the system, somebody like Yeltsin, who's an outsider, he's going to represent the future of liberalism. Gorbachev is going to represent the past of communism, all the terrible things. And because his reforms, even if they're, breakneck and undermining the system, Yeltsin's selling full-on Western liberalism. And Gorbachev, he's selling half measures, some kind of crypto hybrid communist system where it seems like he's dragging his feet or he's lying to the public, trying to maintain the communist status quo. And so when you are the person that's promising reform and promising change, but you're not going through that change immediately, then you're seen in some sense of being the main block to that change, being what is pulling it back. So we see this with Trump. If Trump doesn't kick out or change the immigration policy immediately and then keep saying he's going to fix illegal immigration and he's going to fix the American immigration system for the nativists contingent, the anti-immigration contingent, and he never goes about it, well then the right-wing critics of Trump, like say Nick Fuentes, they are going to see Trump as this liar that's withholding the real change from them. And so Gorbachev, as time goes on, despite his desire to do these reforms, he's going to be seen as the person that's withholding the reforms. He's going to be painted into the hardliner, into the Stalin figure by the people that want the reforms and who are moving more radically towards the liberal perspective for Russia and the Soviet society at large, especially in minority republics like Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. The core reason that Gorbachev failed as a leader is that Gorbachev's heart, I think, wasn't in communism or Marxism-Leninism by the time that he became General Secretary. While publicly he would frequently defend his Marxist credentials and at least win the tacit support of communist hardliners during fiery speeches and in public statements, he said that in retrospective, as I said before, that from Chernobyl on he had lost faith in the Soviet system and became a social democrat. Defining Gorbachev's ideological development by certain time periods, it's something that we can't really do. And the reality is that after the Soviet Union collapsed, he's going to have 20/20 hindsight to try and cover up for his mistakes. I think it's better to say that he simply did not have his heart in communism, and he did not have his heart in the global Soviet enterprise, the global communist enterprise. Gorbachev's heart moved away from communism into globalism. Leninist doctrine holds that the conflict between the socialist and capitalist states is predestined by historical materialism, and it's something that ought to be desired. This includes acceptance, not reluctance, in engaging in armed conflict with capitalist powers, along with having a vast military buildup. The Soviet Union had just committed a vast amount of its economy to this buildup and the inevitable war with the capitalist powers. To some extent, it had grown dependent upon arms shipments abroad economically. So there was this feedback mechanism which was feeding into the Cold War tensions, which was positive for the Soviet economy. The occupation and economic support given to the nations of the Warsaw Pact, on the other hand, that's not really positive for the Soviet Union. While the Warsaw Pact nations provided the Soviet Union with the ability to protect its military power, project its military power across Europe and the entire world more readily than if it was contained in its own borders, That was an advantage. But the problem for the Soviet Union was that it was this unpopular occupying power over these countries which had a very similar culture to them. And if there was any revolts that were successful in Eastern Europe, that could lead to blowback within the Soviet Union due to cultural proximity between the Soviet Union and the Eastern European states. The necessity of preventing this blowback was something that was realized with Brezhnev, and that's why the Brezhnev Doctrine happened, where they made it the official state policy to prevent any communist state from backsliding into capitalism or moving towards a form of socialism which was at odds with Moscow's form of socialism. Notice Yugoslavia and the breakaway of Tito from Stalin. His form of socialism wasn't very acceptable to the Soviet Union, and his independence wasn't either there. And so the socialism without a human face in Czechoslovakia in 1968, that's not acceptable either. Preventing this meant that the Soviet Union was willing to use military force to put down any movement away from their ideology. We saw this in 53, 56, 68, and then finally in 79 with Afghanistan. The first three interventions in Eastern Europe, they cost the Soviet Union legitimacy, but they kept the Soviet Union going. When it came to the war in Afghanistan, that, on the other hand, was a fiasco. To begin with, the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan was not a creation of the Soviet Union after the Second World War. It was a product of the coup that occurred there on April 27, 28th, where elements of the Afghan Soviet Party and the military overthrew a previous military dictatorship. It was then named the Sour Revolution, and for the month that it occurred in the traditional Afghan calendar. Afghanistan had already been an unstable state before this coup, with the earlier 1973 coup that led to a military government which overthrew the monarchy in that country. The country was extremely unstable, and the military government was divided between these competing factions, and so there was all these coup attempts between that initial coup in 73 and the one that allowed the communists to come to power. The overwhelming consensus in retrospective with the one where the communists came to power, the Sour Revolution, was that it occurred without Soviet support or foreknowledge. Although it should be noted that the communists acted in the belief that they would be able to solidify their power once they took power in a coup, because they would get the backing of the Soviet Union, because they would move into the communist camp. This is something that you kind of see over and over again with the Third World. A lot of the people in the Third World that became communist, they were not that ideologically committed to communism. They just knew that they would be able to get some pretty broad support from the Soviet Union if they tilted that way. Once in power, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan proved both incredibly unstable, with violent internal infighting, and incredibly unpopular due to its aggressive secular, socialist, and feminist policies. Pushback against these policies occurred pretty fast, and by March 1979, there was widespread revolts going across the country against this communist government. Soviet leadership, despite being at an arm's length with the country before all this, decided that they had to adhere to the Brezhnev Doctrine and prop up this failing government. They ultimately chose to assassinate the general secretary of the country, Havluza Amin, in the process, who had only taken power since September following this intense factional fighting, and the Soviets were able, through covert means, to put in their stooge, Barak Karmel, in his place. As with previous interventions, the opposition to the new Soviet-installed government was crushed, and as soon as that rebellion occurred, then the Soviets felt there was this need for intervention in Afghanistan. they made a bad situation worse by intervening to prop up their own person, and when he was falling out of favor, they made it worse, the situation even worse, by intervening. They would move their troops into the country in the December of 1979, and so they were able to quickly gain control of Kabul and the other major cities in the country. But Afghanistan is a very rural, mountainous, and internally divided country. The best possible environment for a successful guerrilla resistance movement. The Mujahideen resistance fighters, who were often Islamists, that rose up in opposition to the Soviet Union and its kind of puppet government with the Democratic Republic of the Afghanistan, they're going to get international support from Pakistan, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and other nations. And so they are aided by this vast amount of financial resources, and Pakistan and Afghanistan share this massive border, and the Soviet Union's not going to attack Pakistan directly, so Pakistan can kind of act as this base from where the Mujahideen can have strategic depth in order to organize their forces. The Soviets had no clear exit strategy in this war. I mean, their idea was that they had to intervene, that they would just put a new communist into the place. They would get rid of the old, the protesters and the people that were unloyal to communism, like they did in Czechoslovakia or East Germany or in Hungary. But the reality of the situation was there was no entrenched communists there. It was just like this palace economy that decided to become communist for Soviet support. So the war dragged on without any clear strategy or direction, and the Soviet Union went through 4 separate general secretaries over the course of 4 years. To Gorbachev's credit, he recognized that the war was unwinnable and began withdrawing forces following his summation in power after the Rust affair. The Soviets formally withdrew out of the country on the final day that they were there being February 15th, 1989. The war then continued with the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan becoming this Islamic socialist state instead of a Leninist one. But the state still received Soviet support. The war actually ended, though, with the collapse of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan in April of 1992, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in December of 1991. While the Soviet Union had no real chance of seeing the war in Afghanistan leading to a reasonable victory, leaving the conflict did have blowback, which made the country and the leadership look weak. And the withdrawal took place along with Gorbachev's massive cutback in military spending and the end of the occupation of the Warsaw Pact nations in Mongolia, the cutback of support for communist movements worldwide and their allies abroad, furthering the perception that the Soviet government was weak. Likewise, following the Glasnost, the war and some popularity would eat into support for the Soviet government in general. We got to remember that losing a war isn't something that helps with national pride or national identity. Losing a war tends to weaken people's support for the state and their patriotism for it. The pullback of Soviet forces from Eastern Europe would prove to be of far greater psychological impact. I mean, I'm just hammering this home over and over again. I think that other than Gorbachev's internal weakness, and especially when he's put against the gun, he becomes pretty cowardly. But I think that there's this long-standing weakness with the Soviet Union of these Eastern European states, and that's what I'm hammering home over and over again. They're just this catch-22 that they're stuck with. I think that somebody who was more competent than Gorbachev could have solved this better, or could have tried to transition them over the course of decades away from the Soviet Union. But the reality is that they're going to withdraw from them all at once in 1989. They're going to withdraw from East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Bulgaria. And they're just going to allow them to peacefully, instantaneously become liberal democracies. They're not going to try some kind of like step-by-step thing where they become socialism with a human face or anything like that, or even widespread goulash communism. They're just going to allow them to just flip back over into America's camp without a shot being fired, without any real pushback at all. I'm not even saying it has to be violent. Gorbachev could have found ways to drag his feet and just make it this slow process that could go further and further into the 90s. But he just let it happen overnight. Albania collapsed as well. They weren't a Soviet ally at that point. Romania was largely independent of the Soviet Union under Ceausescu by that point, but they were still Soviet allies, so there was no Soviet like contingent there, and that they're independent, but they were Soviet allies, and they did collapse with the rest of the Eastern Bloc states in 1989. When they transitioned towards liberalism, there was the communist leadership in those countries just gave in. It was either they outright collaborated or there was tacit approval on their part. And this kind of shows that there wasn't that many true believers left. And the only people that were true believers, they fled the country fearing human rights tribunes, criminal trials, prison sentences, possible execution, ultimately in the case of Ceausescu. So, that kind of sped up or greased up the change, because the hierarchy within those communist states, when they saw that the Soviet Union wasn't going to back them up anymore, they saw that if they just joined in with the transition, then they could undermine what was seen as their culpability in the crimes of the previous regime. As we all know, and as I've alluded to, Romania's leadership, they didn't go down without a fight. And so there was this violent uprising, kind of like, more or less like a riot that develops after a speech of Ceausescu turned south in December of 89. And so this mass riot erupts. Ceausescu and the Romanian communist leadership tries to send out the military, and then the military ends up joining with these kind of like protesters, rioters, and all that's left to protect Ceausescu is personal guard, which do remain loyal. There's infighting between the kind of like the Royal Guard, or the United States' like Secret Service kind of thing. And they go into infighting with the military, but it quickly gets resolved. Ceausescu gets captured and then put on trial in a matter of hours, a kangaroo trial, and he and his wife are executed the same day on Christmas, I believe, 1989. And this all occurs on live television. So I think that kind of sent shockwaves into the Soviet leadership, and it caused them to fear what was going on. And I think that there was this realization that what Gorbachev was doing could result in their own deaths and was very dangerous. And the Soviet Union by the beginning of 1990 wasn't out. You got to remember that Eastern European Warsaw Pact communism collapsed in 89, but the Soviet Union itself continued until 1991. But there's also another thing that's going to happen with Eastern European communist states, which is a pretty bad forewarning for the future of the Soviet Union. And that is the collapse of Yugoslavia. The collapse of Yugoslavia, I guess until the Ukraine-Russia war now, that made everything else in Eastern Europe look like a walk in the park. And the Soviet Union, they ought to look on to this collapse as something to be feared and something to be avoided, because with Romania and Bulgaria and Hungary and East Germany and Poland and so on, Czechoslovakia, all those states, sure there's minorities there, but they're largely homogeneous nation states. Yugoslavia, like the Soviet Union, it's a mixed multi-ethnic society, and what held both Yugoslavia together and the Soviet Union together, that's the Communist Party. So in some sense, you got to view the Soviet Union as just this giant Yugoslavia with nukes. So if what Gorbachev is doing has led to this collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, and the most multi-ethnic communist country, which is the most internally communist, keep in mind that they were independent of the Soviet Union throughout the entire Cold War, basically, and that they had their own indigenous, self-popular form of communism. There's this concern of the leadership being killed and put on trial, the execution of Ceausescu in Romania, and then outside of your own interest as a leader or your own interest as the nomenclatura, there's just the reality of the bloodshed that's occurring with the wars in Yugoslavia, the Serbs trying to get independent of Croatia, the Croatians trying to get independent from Yugoslavia, the Serbs trying to get independent from Bosnia, and the Bosnians trying to get independent of Serbia, and the whole Kosovo thing, and everything that's going on. So allowing the Eastern European communist states to collapse, it just made the Soviet Union and its leadership look weak, not just from the outside, but most definitely from the inside. So they're going to pull back their military, not just from a sinkhole like Afghanistan, but at the same time they're pulling back their military from, while financially costly and, like I said, kind of this Achilles heel, Eastern Europe isn't in this kind of crisis. It's not at war. And they're doing this all at once. It's like just this perfect storm of showing weakness to the world and internally. And you got to remember that this withdrawal from Eastern Europe, like I said, maybe it could have been salami tactics. If they want to abandon this Achilles heel, maybe they could have salami tacted it. But the sense that Eastern Europe was on the verge of breaking away from the Soviet Union at any point, that's just neocon propaganda. The peak of in Poland, the peak of Solidarity's influence was 1980, 1981. And then it was put down by internal martial law. Poland wasn't on the verge of revolution. East Germany, Czechoslovakia, none of these countries are on the verge of revolution. Gorbachev just wholesale decided to abandon them overnight. And the result is that he's making the Soviet Union into the ultimate paper tiger. And the unrest against the communist regimes, it's going to spread into his own country, and especially into the Baltic republics. Gorbachev unilaterally pulls back from East Germany, something which even the United States, the United Kingdom, and France did not want him to do. They wanted Soviet troops to be stationed indefinitely in East Germany because they didn't want a reunited Germany to appear. West Germany, by that point, was already the biggest economy in Western Europe, in Europe in general, in a sense, because it's really hard to qualify such a autarkic and centrally planned economy as the Soviet Union on the same level as the United Kingdom or France or Spain or Italy. But the United Kingdom and France, they really, really didn't want a unified Italy or Germany because they thought that Germany, and as we know, this is what would happen, would dominate the newly emerging European market. But Gorbachev was more eager to pull back his troops than what the Western powers wanted him to do. he kind of just pulled them back and left them without any real promises or concessions. So, Putin always complains about NATO saying that they're not going to expand expand eastwards after the unification of Germany, and if they expand eastwards, it's going to be this threat to Russia and all this stuff. But like, Gorbachev didn't make any kind of formal written down arrangements with Bush or with Thatcher or with Helmut Kohl, or Mitterrand. He handshake deals it. He doesn't even take like economic concessions or be like, East Germany has to, we have to have this slow process, even some kind of compromise where East Germany is going to reunify with West Germany by 2000, that they're going to maybe set some kind of referendum years in the future. No, he doesn't do anything. He just takes his 600,000 troops, gets no concession, no real formal concessions from the West, and the West doesn't even want this, at least the European West. America is not going to be as concerned about a unified Germany. But Thatcher and Mitterrand, they really do not want a unified Germany. And Gorbachev just handshake deals, don't move NATO eastward. No real formal written down deal. Takes his 600,000 troops in East Germany and just goes back with him to the Soviet Union and just shrinks his military down, and he doesn't have any housing for them or their families, and he leaves his enlisted men destitute. I think that if anything has taught us, in the United States and through history, you got to take care of veterans. Gorbachev, he's not too, up on taking care of his veterans. And so doing this and causing this housing crisis by dumping 600,000 unemployed troops back into the Soviet Union, it's not going to help you be popular when you're already making the government unpopular, already destroyed your economy, and you're opening yourself up for criticism, and now you're being pinned on the entire history of every maltreatment of the entire Soviet era. And this housing crisis and all these enlisted men being dumped back from Afghanistan and being dumped back from Eastern Europe, it's going to reveal, I'm going to mispronounce it, but it reveals Dudovo-Sakva. And so Dudovo-Sakva, it's this culture of extreme hazing which had developed in the Soviet military in the 1960s and continues onward in the Russian military to some extent to this day. And the reasoning for this is because the Soviet Union had this 2-year conscript cycle. And so what happens is that you have a junior, first year, kind of like freshman conscripts, and then you have a senior, second year conscripts. And so it leads into this really bad natural culture of hazing. And so another thing that the Soviet because tie my tongue for a second, but another thing that the Soviet Union doesn't do that Western Europe did when it advanced its militaries is that the Soviet Union doesn't have as many NCOs. It has a very minimal use of NCOs. So what you're doing is that all these senior servicemen, they're going to be given these second-year servicemen over these first-year servicemen. They're going to get these positions of power that you'd give to NCOs like sergeants, power over these enlisted men in the Western military. You're giving these men that are and they're going to be in it for years and years and decades and eventually get a pension. But with this 2-year conscript system, you're giving power and little oversight to these second-year men to kind of be over the top of the first-year men, and this leads to this really horrible culture of hazing. And so it just kind of cycles through. There's nothing to break it because it's just this constant 2-year cycle. The first year gets hazed, the second year enters their second year, and then hazes the new first year, and it just continues indefinitely. This would be a widespread scandal, which is now able to spread throughout the country due to Glasnost. So these scandals are greatly going to denigrate the public's trust in the military and conscription in the Soviet armed forces. And so as soon as the hazing is brought to light, you have this rampant amount of draft dodging, which is occurring, and the military is just hemorrhaging men because parents, they don't want to subject their children to the hazing. And this is this other common thing that you'll see throughout the world. The federal or central government's most popular institution is almost always the military, and it's the one that has the most public trust. So the Soviet Union is losing public trust in its military. That's not good. Despite the obvious examples of mass unpopularity across Europe, and the apparent reality that if communist parties allow free elections, they're going to be overwhelmingly defeated, Gorbachev is going to pursue transition of the Soviet Union full speed into liberal democracy, or at least a partial democracy. And so this final movement of reform, the final kind of nail in the coffin, is democratia, or democratization. And this engineers a final death spiral of the Soviet Union. Democratization is defined in this case as a radical restructuring of the central government to resemble a liberal democracy. They're going to have a new legislative body which is created, which is popularly elected instead of, you kind of earn your way into it. And this new legislature is the Congress of People's Deputies. The Soviet Union had been a state which constitutionally before only had a single branch of government, the unilateral Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union. They only have one. It's just a legislature. The Supreme, the unicameral. That's the right word. Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union. And the General Secretary, he just kind of acts executively as the executive of that legislature. And then he appoints his cabinet. Well, the Gorbachev reforms then gut that earlier Supreme Soviet and alienate its members. And he starts on this process of alienating the Communist Party and the traditional way that everything is set up, structurally speaking. The country would also become a presidential republic. They're going to move away from this whole the head of the Communist Party, the General Secretary, is who runs everything, into having a formal presidency. And Gorbachev doesn't have any election to it, right? He just becomes the president. And so he shifts over without any legitimacy from being General Secretary to being president. So at the same time, he's putting up all the members of the Communist Party that got their positions within it, within the legislature. He's making them run for office. He doesn't have to run for office himself. He just gifts himself the presidency. And so you have this other problem here with this shifting towards liberal democracy. There's no doubt that I think that Gorbachev, he was planning on transitioning the country to a fully fledged liberal democracy eventually, and that this was some kind of stopgap measure. Now, I talked about how perhaps they should have, taken bit by bit the economy and moved it towards a market economy, or made all these stopgaps with leaving Eastern Europe, right? Maybe they should have set a hard referendum or something like that for East Germany getting to West Germany or something like that, or like withdrawing the troops over a course of years instead of weeks. But when you're talking about reforming a government and making a new constitution, that's something you have to make then and there and just go with it. You can't piecemeal a constitution, because a constitution, that's your outline for the country and the government. You can't renege on it and then renege on it again. You have to be fully firm with what you're doing. And so with Gorbachev being half in and half out and then wanting to move later into a full liberal democracy, well, that's really bad. That makes it so that the populace is seeing you as withholding it. Your compromised position here seems to be like some backwards way of you retaining power. And you're not helping it by just parachuting yourself into the presidency that you just created. And like I said before, you're alienating your previous base by making them liable as never before to real elections, while you yourself are not liable to these real elections. And whenever you do a halfway measure, when you're trying to be a reformer and the majority wants a full measure, you're seen as withholding the full reform, even if you're the person pushing for that reform. Democrats in America, they see Obamacare, the real ones, they see Obamacare as this piecemeal, compromise, weak thing. And so liberals in the Soviet Union, those that want a true democracy, they see Gorbachev's new government system as this piecemeal, half-hearted thing, and that Gorbachev is the person that's blocking true democracy from taking root in the country. By putting his new legislature, which isn't just a communist body organ, it's meant to be a real legislature that's supposed to work with his new presidency together, something akin to a actual, liberal democracy constitution. By putting them up to popular vote, what ends up happening is that he's still doing this half measure, where it's a single party state, where there's the Communist Party is the only legal party. Well, what ends up happening is that all these people, they can't form their own party, but what they can do is that they can run as independents. You can either be a member of the Communist Party, or you can be not a member of the Communist Party. Likewise, the Communist Party is top-down determining who's going to be the candidates. They're kind of picking candidates to be, they're not based on charisma, but based on backroom deals, party politics. And so they create this kind of primary system, like akin to an American primary system, within their single party state. And so you have all these independents who are charismatic. And so what ends up happening is that all these hand-picked, parachuted Communist Party members are going to be all lose. Many of them are going to lose to all these new independent charismatic politicians that aren't handpicked in these open elections that are either handpicked Communist Party members or independent, just independent people that decide to run. And so Gorbachev, he's really opening up to this widespread criticism, both from the ideologically committed communists and committed reformers. He's neutral to Steel Zinn's stuff. He's neutral on a moving train. And it's transparently obvious Gorbachev's not a real communist to the communists, but to the general public, he seems like a hypocrite who is trying to, it's like a little kid that's like, I'm going to clean my room, and he shoves everything down beneath his bed and doesn't enact any real change. So he's making himself to the general public and the true reformers that want democracy, even though he wants democracy himself, into a kind of dictatorship. And these reforms, they're just window dressing. They're just shoving it under your bed and saying that everything is fine and not changing anything. So there is nobody that's going to like him at this point. Everything, every segment of the economy, the military, the civil structure, the legislature, everything is getting screwed up by his ideas. There's nothing he's doing that's positive. And now nobody likes him at all, and he has no supporters. And these semi-free elections, they're not just for the central government of the Soviet Union. They're for the 15 constituent republics of the country in their own independent legislatures. And you got to remember that the Soviet Union, you have this de jure written constitution, and you have this de facto government, the de jure government of the constitution of the official posts, and you have the de facto Communist Party. So if you return to the real constitution, you undermine the Communist Party, the Soviet Union, as on paper, is not a federation. It is a very loose confederation. And that you have 15 autonomous republics, which are countries that are only there based on their own agreement, in paper at least, outside of the Communist Party, that they want to be there. There's nothing constitutionally to prevent, Lithuania, Georgia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and of course, Russia itself from leaving this confederation. And this is getting dicey because you got to remember that Yugoslavia just had a full-scale meltdown along ethnic lines. Russia could have a full-scale meltdown along ethnic lines, according to these 15 countries that have nothing to hold themselves together other than the Central Communist Party. And so within all these constituent republics, they're going to be open up to independent people running on their own and getting elected. They're going to be elected, and those people, just like in Yugoslavia, are going to turn out to be nationalists. And their route to popularity is populist by pushing back against the center. And you have one particularly important example. On June 12, 1991, Boris Yeltsin was elected president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. Russia, the country, outright. Yeltsin had run as an independent. Yeltsin had run winning over 58% in a very crowded field. And much can be said about Yeltsin as a man. He suffered from severe depression and alcoholism. He had suicide attempts and would self-harm himself. He was an absentee president after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early era of the Russian Federation, and he was consumed during this period by depression and alcoholism, and his leadership definitely helped Russia's transition and made it worse. All this being said, though, I gotta tell you guys the truth. The reality of Yeltsin is that he is an Hegelian world spirit, and he was filled with incredible courage and fortitude. And while he may have been an incredibly divisive leader, even more than somebody like Stalin, he was an incredibly decisive man. He had balls of fucking steel. And he is the wrecking ball of steel that's going to destroy the Soviet Union. Before becoming president of the Soviet Russian Republic, Yeltsin had been in construction. He served as a middle-level Communist Party bureaucrat. He was the first secretary of, I'm going to mispronounce this, Servidovsk Oblast. He was the first secretary of Gorkom, the Gorkom of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He was chairman of the Supreme Soviet of the Russian SFSR, and he is a member of the Congress of People's Deputies of Russia. Anyway, Yeltsin had become a member of the Politburo and then was demoted by Gorbachev after he attempted suicide following a public spat with Gorbachev when he wanted more radical reform. Famously, in 1989, he went to the United States and had a near mental breakdown when he first saw a grocery store. And this is real. This is something that actually happened. Yeltsin seeing a grocery store radicalized him. While Gorbachev had publicly humiliated Yeltsin by expelling him from the Politburo, he created this grudge in Yeltsin. As the Soviet Union began to enter into this terminal decline, Gorbachev became ever so increasingly less popular, and Yeltsin became ever increasingly more popular as an opposition figure within Russia outright. He was the person that was becoming the focus, the true reformer. He's the linchpin, the embodiment of real reform. While Gorbachev, he's turning into the embodiment of the pushback against the reform, despite his own personal beliefs and what he's done so far. Gorbachev backed Yeltsin's opponents in the election, and then Yeltsin became overwhelmingly victorious, and Yeltsin knew that. It's just contributing more and more to this personal grudge that they have between each other. And you know what? The reality is, Gorbachev could have exiled Yeltsin. Gorbachev could have killed him. He could have done all these things before the August coup happened. He knew that Yeltsin was his primary opponent. He knew that Yeltsin was dangerous. But Gorbachev did not have the backbone to go through with saving the country. And that's the danger that you're going to see. Gorbachev believed in keeping Yeltsin as an opponent rather than using any means at his disposal in eradicating his opponents as you would in an authoritarian regime. And, you know, the point for democracy or any kind of liberal structure in Russia is really past, because even if Russia had been a liberal democracy, the level of emergency that was occurring in 1991 was off the charts. Everything was going wrong, and the country was sleepwalking itself into a severe famine and civil war. As the Soviet Union began to tear at the seams, the military was beginning to intervene to break up protest and try and keep the country together. And so you have these massacres which are going on by the Soviet government. And Gorbachev, the massacres of these civilians rested on his shoulders. And Gorbachev, he's directly ordering them. So Gorbachev's ordering these massacres of protesters like Deng Xiaoping in Tiananmen Square. And Gorbachev could, he could gun down Yeltsin if he wanted to, but he doesn't. And what's even worse is Gorbachev, he doesn't stick by his violence. He doesn't own up to his violence. He throws his violence under the bus and he blames it on somebody else. Something that is not going to win him favors in the military, which he just cut back on and dumped without any concessions hundreds of thousands of troops back into the country and made them look like complete idiots and fools and made the Soviet Union into an incredibly weak-looking country from the outside. So the Soviet Union, so anyway, let's talk about the first of these massacres. On December 16th to 19th in 1986, thousands of Kazakhs gathered to protest the dismissal of the ethnic Kazakh Dinmuka Hamed Kanev, I have no idea how to pronounce that, from office in Kazakhstan as the first secretary of the Communist Party of Kazakhstan, and he put the ethnic Russian Gennady Koblin into power, and that guy was parachuted in and had no connection to Kazakhstan. The military police were dispatched there to break up the uprising, and they ended up killing hundreds. in retrospect, these events would become known as the Jelosquan, or the December Uprising, and it became pretty important in modern Kazakh nationalism. So in early April 1989, Georgian nationalists marched in from the House of Government in Tbilisi demanding independence. On April 9th, 21 Georgian protesters refused to leave and were killed by Soviet special forces in melee combat, the Soviet soldiers killing them largely with spades. Initial statements by Soviet authorities blamed the protesters, who did not disperse when told to by the authorities. And the Patriarch of Georgia warned them about what was going to happen and said that they ought to disperse because they were going to be forcibly dispersed for the protest. Some sources say that they attacked first, actually, against the police. They attacked them with stones, metal chains, rods, and other improvised melee weapons. Later, during the First Congress of People's Deputies in May to June 1989, Gorbachev then blamed the military for the action, throwing the military and other communists under the bus, when he could have easily argued that these protesters had attacked the military. He throws the military under the bus and alienates them. And he doesn't use that event as a way to spring forth the military and try and reclaim order. He throws the military trying to reclaim order under the bus. So fast forward to early January 1991. There's yet another example of Soviet troops massacring citizens protesting. In the early spring of 1990, Lithuania's local government had declared independence, and key buildings ended up being occupied by the Soviet military in order for them to truly enact any kind of real independence. And so the nation was put under internal blockade, and their local economy was destroyed as a way to peacefully punish them without killing people. So riots occurred in early January, and there were concerns that ethnic violence would erupt by Lithuanians against the ethnic Russian population in the country, which had settled more after the annexation of the country after World War II. And so Gorbachev ordered the military in to protect the ethnic Russians in Lithuania, and they occupy Vilnius and put down the disorder. And so when they put down this disorder in January 11th to 13th, 14 citizens or civilians end up being killed by the Soviet military. The Soviet Union was criticized for massacring these civilian protesters across the liberal world. And then as he was criticized for what he was doing, Gorbachev then pulled the military, or pushed the military under the bus again for following his own orders when they're trying to restore order in that country and trying to defend ethnic Russians against ethnic hostilities from Lithuanians, and that the integrity of the Soviet Union was being threatened. And so even outside of like a Machiavellian sense, he had every justification to prevent the country from falling apart. But what does he do? He demonizes the military and blames it for his own actions. Okay, this isn't going to surprise my followers, but I'm not a liberal, and I do not believe that people have an inherent absolute right to criticize and protest against the state no matter what. When protesters threaten the legitimacy of the state, and if the state has a choice between allowing those protesters the right to continue with their demonstrations and possibly overthrow it, and that would put the country into the state of the anarchy, the government, the state, has every right to self-defend themselves and restore order. The problem is that when killing protesting civilians, you're only vindicated in history if you win. If you lose in history, then you are going to become a villain, right? And so this is the problem with any kind of authoritarian clampdown. If you dare, you get vindicated by history. If you don't dare, then you are going to be villainized by history. So you're going to be a loser if you don't try. And if you try and you lose, you're going to be a loser. But Gorbachev, like, there's a situation here where he can either not try and be a loser. He can either try and put down people by force, put the country under martial law, and see where that goes. Try and save the country. Gorbachev goes for using the military to restore order, and then pulls back, doesn't take ownership, blames the military for what he ordered them to do, and then alienates the military. Not a good look. In 1989, nearly every communist country was on the verge of collapse. There was, of course, one country which faced large-scale protest and did not give in and did not shut them down with force, and that was the right decision for that state. That's the People's Republic of China, and that's the Tiananmen Square massacre. Other countries throughout history, I don't have to be pro-communist in saying this, but martial law can be justified. The Russian Empire saved itself through martial law. Communist Poland saved itself through martial law. South Korea saved itself through martial law. Turkey saved itself through martial law. Egypt saved itself through martial law. Pakistan saved itself through martial law. Chile saved itself through martial law. Using martial law as a way to stabilize your country, that's not just something that can be justified. It's something which ought to be done in certain circumstances. You need to do it. The benefits of it are justified. The reality is that civil war, anarchy, chaos, these are things that you don't want to wish upon your enemy. This is something you do not want to live through. Gorbachev had the responsibility as the leader of the country. He had the responsibility to defend the Soviet Union and to defend the populace from themselves. He could have saved the country. And you know what? The reality is that the collapse of the Soviet Union put on a tremendous hardship upon the people of that country. Put a tremendous hardship on the Russians ethnically. Put a tremendous hardship on Ukraine. The collapse of the Soviet Union led to multiple wars, including the Ukraine-Russian war. If Gorbachev had a backbone, he could have found a way out of this. He could have found a middle path, right? He didn't, though. He had no backbone, and he was a coward. And that is what is going to lead to the collapse of his country and the hardship for his people. By 1991, the Soviet Union was rapidly descending into chaos due to, and this is exemplified also by his limited use of martial law and pulling back from it. The Caucasus in particular was turning into this hotbed of violence. And the beginning stages of the Nagorno-Karabakh War and the South Odessan War by this time were already happening. The Baltic states declared their independence outright, and their defiance was proven an example for all the other republics of the Soviet Union to leave the Confederation. The resistance and ethnic violence in these peripheral republics had the risk of spreading outwards to the core Slavic republics of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Just as the unrest from Eastern Europe to the Soviet Union proper was having. The nation was entering into this death spiral, and we know in retrospect it was going to collapse. Committing to martial law and emergency powers across the board could have saved it from this ultimate collapse. Gorbachev, though, did not do this, and he backed out in cowardice. Like with his halfway reforms between communism and liberalism, backing in and out and zigzagging with martial law from cowardice is going to make him into a villain. He's withholding martial law from the people that want it, the military. He's blocking them from doing it. He's blocking the hardliners from doing it. And he's the villain. He's the dictatorship to the reformers. He is no longer a reformer in their eyes. He's a dictatorship. He's a dictator, and he's a villain that has gloves on his hand. He's a weak coward, and he's a dictator that has blood on his hands. No win-win here for him. It should be said that at this point in 1991, if somebody supported the Soviet Union, that at this point meant keeping the country together. It didn't even mean communism anymore. As we know now, the outcome of the collapse of the Soviet Union would be the division of the 15 republics of the Confederation, and you would have all these spread out civil wars between them that have occurred since 1991. But there could have been an outcome in which the country transitioned out of communism and became a single entity, which would be more powerful than the Russian Federation, and which the Russian Federation, the ethnic Russians, would not have dropped in their birth rates. You know, Russians were at replacement level. Actually, the 1980s were a high period of regaining ethnic birth rates within Russia. So there is a reality where you have a kind of Russian Federation that continues to this day, that has something like a population of 350 or 400 million people, which is more powerful than the Russian Federation. It's at least a great power, if not a superpower anymore. And, you know, that's the reality. That's what could have happened. But the weakness here, that is, it rests on Gorbachev's shoulders. But there also could have been one very large civil war that left millions dead, a second Russian civil war, a greater Yugoslavia, a Yugoslavia with nukes. Now let's thank God that this didn't happen. So, in August of 1991, Gorbachev was driving the country towards what would have been called in retrospect the New Union Treaty, which was where he was going to have this new federal confederate constitution for the Soviet people, which would be drafted by the individual republics as equals. The previous Soviet constitution, as written, did not provide for a strong central government. It was the Communist Party as an organization which acted as the glue which held that country together. The treaty was set to diminish the already weak central power of the Soviet Union even more, though. Gorbachev was not going to get a strong central government in this treaty. The way it was looking was that it was going to weaken the center more and more and would lead to an ultimate disintegration of the country. Armenia, Georgia, Moldova, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they already said that they're not going to participate in this new treaty, and they had already declared independence by this point, at least on paper. To prevent this treaty, which was the road to nowhere, Gorbachev's own appointed underlings launched the August coup to prevent this likely dissolution of the central government. The coup happened on August 18, 1991. The coup was led by a Gang of Eight, filled by Gorbachev's own appointees. You have his own vice president, Gendry Yandiev, an office that he created. The vice presidency, remember, was his own radical reforms a year prior. The coup, as far as we can tell, was designed to be an auto coup which placed Gorbachev in power, but ironically without his own consent. The Gang of Eight's plan was to enact martial law through this coup and then offer the country in a state of martial law in the hopes of to Gorbachev himself, in the hopes that he would understand at that point the direness of the situation, and that he would use the dictatorship to form a new constitution which wasn't necessarily communist, I should say, but would have a strong central government. And that way they could save the country. Gorbachev at that point was in his summer retreat on the Black Sea when this occurred, and he was offered to lead the country in this strange plan, which he did not devise. You know, this plan was, of course, idiotic. They should have just killed Gorbachev and installed themselves as leaders. Because why would Gorbachev trust it? He naturally had good enough instincts not to trust it, and he rejected the offer, which put the coup into this kind of prolonged limbo where they didn't know what to do. And Yandiev, because they're in this prolonged limbo where they don't know what to do, they don't have the resolve or courage to kill or even exile Gorbachev, and take formal control of the country themselves. And ultimately, because of this lack of an action in this very volatile situation, the coup dissolved and it ended. During the course of this brief coup, critically, Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic, and now the arch anti-communist and personal nemesis of Gorbachev, he wasn't arrested and he wasn't detained by the conspirators. And so Yeltsin became the Hegelian world spirit. He rushed to the White House, which is the seat of the Russian Republican government at that time, and he began to protest the coup and the presumed dictatorship that was there to save the Soviet Union. The military then surrounded Yeltsin and the other protesters that were with them, but because of their lack of agency and their lack of resolve, they didn't arrest him and they didn't kill him. And so the whole Russian populace at this time rallies behind Yeltsin as he becomes the world spirit, the wrecking ball that will destroy the Soviet Union. And he's able, through this, to gain legitimacy and become the paramount ruler of the Soviet Union over and against Gorbachev. On August 21st, Yandiev met with Gorbachev, the vice president, offered him the status of this martial law pretty directly, and then Gorbachev rejects it. Gang of Eight concedes. They get on the airplane to go back to Moscow. Gorbachev labeled them as traitors, and they return to Moscow, and they go up to the legislature. Gorbachev's rejection of the coup did not result in him being seen as the savior for democracy, liberalism, or the reform away from communism. Instead, Yeltsin took on that mantle, and now Yeltsin, despite Gorbachev resisting the coup, was the champion of the reform. He was the focal point, the pivot point, the paramount leader. Yeltsin and Gorbachev then addressed the legislature on national television together, and Yeltsin publicly humiliates Gorbachev and demands to his face that the Communist Party be banned. Gorbachev then gives in to Yeltsin's demands and resigns as leader and bans the Communist Party. Ukraine then declares its own unilateral declaration of independence on August 24th, meaning that there's no core republics, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, the core Slavic republics, to stand together. And it's not a peripheral country anymore, a small Caucasus country or the Baltic states. It's the real true core of the Soviet Union, which is pushing back against the middle, Ukraine. After this coup, Yeltsin had basically gained the mandate from heaven, and he was a paramount and de facto ruler of the Soviet Union in these final stages. With the Communist Party banned, the Soviet Union was now nothing more than a loose confederation between 15 separate nations. Without the Communist Party, Gorbachev only had ceremonial power now. Yeltsin, as the head of the Russian Republic, was able to take control of funding of the central government and shifted the tax revenue and funding he received from the Russian Republic away from the Soviet central government and starved it and starved Gorbachev out and basically made Gorbachev unable to do anything. And he just had an empty building which was completely subservient to any tax funds from Yeltsin himself. Gorbachev, without any real options left, and with the Ukrainian Republic not wanting to be part of the Soviet Union anymore, he only had one course of action, and that was to try and use the already previously scheduled meeting for this new Union Treaty in his favor and try and make this weird backroom deal with the Central Asian republics and make them the center of the Soviet Union over and against Yeltsin's Russia. And Yeltsin saw this new constitution, and he really knew what he had to do. Yeltsin hated Gorbachev and didn't want to be any kind of second banana in this new republic. The Central Asian states and Belarus were landlocked, and they're completely independent on Russia. And so he's not going to give in to Gorbachev making him some kind of second banana when Russia is supposed to be the Soviet Union. Russia is the center of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's supposed to serve Russia. He's not going to sit by and have, Belarus and Kazakhstan call the shots over Russia. And Yeltsin doesn't want to have any kind of country where Gorbachev is making this agreement where Ukraine can leave, and then Central Asia are going to stay in as, kind of these countries which are going to suck off welfare from Russia as they had before without a Slavic majority. Because if Ukraine leaves, then ethnic Slavs could end up only being a plurality of the country. Without Ukraine, then the Soviet Union isn't a supermajority, it's just a slight majority Slavic. And it would completely lose its kind of Russo-centric identity. Even if it's an affirmative action empire and everything, it's still this Russian speaking bloc. And this new Union Treaty that Gorbachev's going to have, this deal with Central Asia that's going to drag in Russia with the Soviet Union, that's going to change the trajectory of what the Soviet Union is. It's going to be half Central Asian and it's going to be half Russian, as opposed to majority Slavic, with Central Asia and the Baltic states and the Caucasus as these minorities. So Yeltsin knew what he had to do something, and so his solution was brilliant. He preempted Gorbachev's meeting with a meeting of his own, where he formed his own new union. What he does is that he calls the three members of the Slavic republics together secretly, the three Slavic republics being Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, of course, and they meet together and all unilaterally declare independence from the Soviet Union and set the Soviet Union on the course to dissolving. This meeting became known as the Belaslava Accords or the Minsk Agreement. It happened on December 8th, 1991. The three of them kept this a secret from Gorbachev and the public at large, since technically speaking it was treason. And what they did just dissolved the Soviet Union. And so they were under this fear that somehow, even if Gorbachev had no power and was ceremonial, that somehow he'd be able to order the military to stop them or something like that. So that's why they met up in secret. And so Gorbachev still is able to go on with this new Union Treaty, but what's going to result from this Union Treaty is the Commonwealth of States, this loose intergovernmental agency which facilitates trade between the post-Soviet republics. And so even though from the 8th on the country is basically dissolved in all but name, Gorbachev's going to try and maintain his office for a little bit longer, and he finally resigns on December 26, 1991, and that's what marks the end of the Soviet Union in the official histories, his final resignation. And that's where you get the change of the flags over the Kremlin from the Soviet flag, this is such a famous image, to the Russian flag. And the Soviet Union's over. Soviet Union ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. Or at least a low whimper and, a lot of smaller bangs. Not a giant bang, but a lot of smaller bangs with the regional wars. There wasn't, thank God, because there wasn't going to be this general civil war to maintain it. And, World War III, the NATO Warsaw Pact war never ended either. While there were external pressures on the Soviet Union and its economic system, kind of was chained in with this ideology, neither of these things, though, I think were what ultimately led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think they're kind of tertiary problems that contributed to the collapse or made the situation worse. I think that the primary reason for the collapse was self-inflicted wounds due to incompetence from its leadership. The weak leadership, which is exemplified by Mikhail Gorbachev, is a shit man of history, whose tenure as the General Secretary of the Communist Party and then President of the Soviet Union was marked without any kind of cautiousness or pragmatism. Instead, it was an all-out liberal, ideological suicide move. The Soviet Union certainly needed reforms. Gorbachev was incredibly aggressive and radical in the ways that he did them, and never stopped pushing them forwards. He never stopped to breathe and stabilize without going towards another reform. He never backtracked on them either. To make matters worse, many of these reforms, they're very hastily done and without any true understanding of economics or the world stage or just the Soviets' own internal system. Rapidity of these reforms then happened in such a quick succession that their shortcomings kept feeding into each other and led into the spiraling collapse of which Gorbachev and the underlings that he picked were really too cowardly to stop until it was far, far too late. And the underlings, even they, in that coup, knew that they had to do something. But even at that point, Gorbachev, he still was too cowardly to do what needed to be done. And so the result is that the Soviet Union collapsed. Thank God there was no World War III, and thank God there was no Yugoslavia with nukes. But the Soviet Union could have transitioned out of communism. The Soviet Union could have transitioned into some kind of softer form of communism with a human face. The borders of the Soviet Union could have been maintained, and that there wouldn't have been all these terrible wars. The standard of living brought on by the collapse and the complete economic incompetence of the reformers, especially in Russia and Ukraine, that the standard of living wouldn't have fallen out. The Russians and Ukrainians and Belarusians, they wouldn't have the sustained drop in their fertility. All these things could have been avoided had they had a better leader, but unfortunately they didn't. They were stuck with the shit man of history, Mikhail Gorbachev.